Hey everyone, so I was recently asked to make a video talking about the swords that I own, and at first I declined because I thought, well, I don't have very many swords, especially not for a YouTuber, but on reconsidering then I thought, well, each of my swords does actually have its own story, so here we are with this video, and I hope you enjoy it. So I don't like to think of myself as a collector, and like I said, I don't own very many swords. I've got 6 swords, which by YouTuber standards is not very much at all, and I like to think that I buy my swords out of pure necessity and necessity alone. But here we are with 6 swords, so it's probably not true. There's probably a few wants here and there that have made their way in. So for our first sword, then we have this Jian, or this in Korean gum, and it's made out of 1060 steel. Quite nice, reasonably nicely cast fittings, and I got it for about $130. So in Korea and China, then the gum or the Jian is seen as the more noble sword compared to the do or the dao, depending on whether you're Chinese or Korean. And so the do would be like katana, and the Jian is a straight double-edged sword, usually used by people of higher ranking in society. And so I thought, well, for my first sword, then should probably get one of these rather than a barbaric sword. And at the time that I was practicing taekwondo sword, so taekwondo sword, then you can use it with a gum or a do. So I thought, well, we'll go with this. And I'd been practicing for maybe about 1 year with wooden weapons, seriously practicing, that is. I'd done taekwondo sword as a teenager, and I picked it up back again in my 20s, and so here we are with this one. So I bought this because I was sick of training with wooden weapons and I wanted the weight of an actual sword. So I got this unsharpened, made from 1060 steel, reasonably nice sword. Now it's supposed to be a hanjian, but it's definitely not weighted like a hanjian. It's weighted very much like a Korean gum, which has a similar weighting to a katana. And that worked out in my favour, unknowingly, because it was the first sword that I bought. So I didn't do as much research as I should have, and so it's a hanjian that weighs like a Korean gum. Now if I were to buy another one, then I would either get a Korean gum, which is weighted like a gum, so like Goryeo Swords has a really nice one that's rather ungodly expensive but looks very nice, or I would go for something like LK Chen's hanjian, which is made as a hanjian and weighs and moves like a hanjian, rather than something that's supposed to be a hanjian but weighs and moves like a Korean gum. Now the main gripe that I have about this one is that it has a perfectly round handle, and that makes edge aligning very, very annoying. So if you hold onto it here, then edge aligning becomes annoying. So what I tend to do is I tend to put my finger on the guard, and that helps me with edge aligning, but it's just annoying to do. It's not necessarily how you should be training, because then your index finger ends up just floating on a guard, and it does a lot of the work rather than these last 3 fingers as the proper grip should. So that brings us to our second sword, which is this white katana here. And I got this about 2 years into me properly training swordsmanship, and I started going down the path of Jedokgum rather than just taekwondo sword. And Jedokgum has more slashing techniques. It's only got one stabbing technique, which is very unlike other Korean sword forms like Bonkugum and Yedo, which are also from the Korean manuscripts. And so it started to make sense of having a do rather than a gum, because a gum works primarily as a stabbing weapon and a do works much better as a slashing weapon. So I bought this 1060 steel katana. Now it's 1060 steel, got a fake hamon, which has been pretty scuffed up from a lot of the work that I've done, which I'll talk about later, and it's got quite nice kashirai. It's got a nice dragon on the suba, and it's got these nice chrysanthemum flowers as manuki. And I bought this for about $140, and I bought it unsharpened because I wanted a blunt training weapon that had the weight, and it started out unsharpened, and then when I felt like I was ready to start cutting with a two-handed sword, I sharpened it, and I made a video about that, which you can see up there. And then I started training in Iaido. So in Iaido, then they use unsharpened swords, and they wouldn't let me have a sharp sword in the Iaido dojo, So I blunted this again. So it's gone from being blunt to sharp back to being blunt. And this is one of my favourite swords because I've just got such a long history with it. You can see on the guard that it started out as nice and white, and now it's got all of this gunk here where my hands were because I've popped blisters, I've bled onto it. Just trained very hard with it. Now, at the end of the day, it is a cheap sword. The Ito is this cheap synthetic stuff. The Kushirai are pot metal. It's made from 1060 steel that's got a fake hamon on it, not properly clay tempered. It is properly through tempered though. And it weighs, it doesn't have the grace and finesse that a proper katana should. It's a little bit on the heavy side. But at the end of the day, this is my go-to training weapon just because of familiarity and because we've got such a long history together and I quite like this. Alright, so my third and fourth swords that I bought were these two Wakizashi, my red and, well, I call it black, but it's actually a dark blue. And I bought these two about a little over 2 years into my training, and I thought, well, I should probably get on to doing some tamashigiri and cutting, and at the time that I was feeling more confident with my one-handed techniques rather than my two-handed sword techniques, so I thought I'd get a Wakizashi. Now, a Wakizashi is slightly shorter than a Korean kwando, which can be used with one hand, but I thought shorter might be a little bit safer, and they balance quite similarly, so I ended up getting it. And then at the time I was also looking at sangum, which is another form in the Korean manuscripts, which uses two one-handed swords. And I thought, well, one day I'd like to be there, so I bought two of them. And I got the pair of them for $500, and they're made of T10 steel, and they're both clay tempered. This one has a really beautiful chordi hamon, and this one has a nice wavy hamon. And the two of these have flower-themed kushirai. And the reason for that is because sangum is this beautiful, elegant form with flowing motions, so I thought the flower theme fitted quite well. So these have been with me ever since I started tamashigiri, and also that's about the same time that I started a YouTube channel to document my training and see how far we get. And these have worked fantastically. I use these as my beta swords essentially because they're cheap enough that it won't cause me too much gripe if something happens to them, but they're also not so cheap that I'm worried for my own safety using them. So if there's anything that I'm unsure about cutting, I'm not sure if it will cut through, I'm not sure if I can cut through it because of my skill level, I use these. And so far I've actually not damaged them. They've held up to everything I've thrown at them. But if they were to be damaged, I think I'd be a little bit sad, but it wouldn't be too much of a deal. Now what I really love about these is they have a katate style wrap. So what that means is that it's got this flat paneling here rather than the diamonds going all the way through like in the traditional hineri maki wrap. And the katate maki wrap means one-handed wrap. And I think that it makes a huge difference because it helps those last two fingers just sit on a flat section, and I feel like it makes it a nicer grip to hold. Not everyone will share that opinion, but for me then, if I were to get a one-handed sword, I would absolutely get the katate wrap. I think it makes a huge difference. Now for my fifth sword, then we have the byeolungeom. Now I've done two relatively in-depth videos about my byeolungeom, so you can go and see those. But this is a Korean sword made by a Korean master smith, and that is the reason why I bought it. Because Korean master swordsmiths won't be around forever. As modern times progress, then the quality of swords becomes less and less important. And so I really wanted to have a nice quality sword made by a Korean master smith so that I could pass it down to future generations, and I see this as my own treasure, really. So it's based on a byeolungeom, which is the swords used by the king's guards, and you can see by the fancy fittings that is exactly what it is. And I paid about $4,500 for this after tax, which was not a small sum of money for someone at my stage in life. So it's made out of Tamahagane steel, and I'm not sure if you can see it, but it's got a really nice irregular hamon that just fits the blade really nicely. And you can see that the blade profile is slightly different from a katana. It's a little bit wider, and it cuts with a lot of authority, but it still feels fantastic to hold in the hands, and it maneuvers beautifully, and even if your form is slightly wrong, it still cuts. Now, originally I wasn't actually planning to buy this sword. I wanted one of the Kwando, which Goryeo Swords was offering, but that was sold out and they hadn't updated their site. So Mr. Moon, the head of research at Goryeo Swords, offered this sword to me before it went up on their website. And I saw it and I loved it. It was a beautiful sword. So I said yes, and here we are with it now. Now I've got a few problems with the sword, and that is that it is too nice. It handles way too nicely, so if your form is wrong, you can still make things work using this, and it cuts even if your form is slightly off, which, if we're training to have proper form, training to be a good swordsman with perfect edge alignment, it's not the sword to use because it will correct your mistakes and it will just cut through for you anyway. Now the other part of it being too nice is that it is very, very expensive. And so after my white katana got blunted for Iaido practice, then this was the only sharp sword I had to use for Tamahagane, and it was absolutely terrifying because if I made a mistake with this and damaged this, it's $4,500 that's gone, and also a treasure that I hope to pass on to future generations, which has been damaged because I'm stupid, essentially. So because of that, then I don't actually train with this very much because it's very, very expensive. And I think it also doesn't necessarily train the best form because it corrects for so many mistakes. But I love this sword, and the guard here is an actual Joseon Dynasty antique from about 200 years ago, and then they've put it onto this sword that they've remade. But it doesn't see as much light of day as a sword like it really should, simply because I don't feel like my skill level is at the point where I can be using this for regular practice. So that brings us to my sixth and final sword, which is this round katana. And I've called it aranami because the kashirae show this beautiful scene of just raging waves, and aranami means stormy waves or rough waves. And the name just jumped out to me when I saw the kashirae, and I thought it was fitting, so I've called it aranami. So this is a 1095 clay tempered katana, which I got for about $360. And I bought it because the byeolungeom was too scary to cut with, and so I bought it for Tamahagane. And this sword is expensive enough and nice enough that I know that the quality is there, but also not so expensive that if I do happen to damage it, it's not so big of a deal compared to the byeolungeom. Now this is probably one of my most pretty swords, and I like it for that reason, but it doesn't actually get much training because if I'm doing non-Tamahagane training, by nature I reach for my white katana by force of habit, and if I am doing Tamahagane, then that's the only time that I really use this. And it's a bit of a shame because it's a really nice sword, especially for its price range. For $360, then it's really nicely made, very, very well built. The only thing is that it doesn't cut as nicely as the byeolungeom. So with the byeolungeom, if your form is slightly off, cut through like butter, no problem. This one, if your form is slightly off, then as it should, it doesn't cut. So at the start when I was transitioning from the byeolungeom to aranami, then I was a little bit frustrated because it just felt like I'd gone backwards in skill. And it wasn't that I'd gone backwards in skill, it was that my byeolungeom was making up for my lack of skill. So this has been good training since. So those are the 6 swords that I own, and I quite like them. Each of them has their own purpose, but I think there's a formula for the number of swords that you absolutely need and cannot live without, and that is the swords that you need is n plus 1. N being the number of swords you own, and plus 1 meaning you always need one more. And even after you've got another one, you still absolutely need another one. It's a very good way to demonstrate what goes on in our minds as sword collectors, swordsmen. There's always something that's a little bit more that we need because it will expand our training, it will help us more with different techniques, whatever you want to justify it. And I try and fight that urge as much as I can because, the money can go to better places like putting food on the table and paying bills. But, if I were to say what is my plus 1 sword, well, I really like Goryeo Swords, Admiral Yi Sun-jin's sword. So this is a sword that's really cool, It's based off Admiral Yi Sun-shin, the Korean war god of the Joseon dynasty. He had two swords which were 197 centimeters long, and they've scaled it back down, so it's about half the size, and it's slightly longer than a katana. But Admiral Yi Sun-shin's sword is a really cool demonstration of the accumulation of Korean technology, Japanese technology, and Chinese technology in swordsmanship. So, like Japanese swords, it's based off a katana really. It's got an unokubi zukuri style blade, but it's supposed to be balanced very much like a Korean sword. And the original is very much based on a Korean sangsudo, which is a ginormous sword. But the interesting thing about this is that it has a pommel that's weighted, very much like Chinese and also Western swords, to help balance it out. So, having never used a sword that's like this, and also looking up to Admiral Yi Sun-shin very much, being a part Korean boy, then I think that this would be a really nice sword that I would love to train with one day. But the truth is that I probably shouldn't be spending that much money on swords, especially when it's not a necessity. So, one day when money is less of an issue, then I'll probably get that. But for now, these are my swords in my collection, and I hope you like seeing them. And with that, I'll see you next time.